Welcome to Malard at Large. Before we start our Q&A session with Stéphane Dujarric, spokesman of the UN Secretary-General António Guterres, right now, my guest profile by Ellen Corby.
A descendant of Robert de Rothschild on his mother's side and of the discoverer of the Spanish flu Bacillus on his father's, Stéphane Dujarric de la Rivière, his full name, has always lived in a cosmopolitan world. Born in 1965 in Paris, he moved to New York City with his mother 9 years later, following a remarriage. He became a brilliant student at Georgetown University in Washington. Upon graduation, Stéphane Dujarric began his international career as a reporter for ABC News. For 9 years, he worked in New York, London, and Paris. Stéphane Dujarric's life took a decisive turn in 2000. He joined the United Nations. First as deputy spokesman, then, in 2005, he became the spokesman for Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary-General. After a short stopover at the United Nations Development Program in a similar position, Stéphane Dujarric returned to the headquarters less than 2 years later as Director of Communications. Then in 2014, he took up the position of spokesperson for the Secretary-General of the United Nations, first with Ban Ki-moon and since 2017 with António Guterres. A skilled diplomat and media savant, Stéphane Dujarric has established a smooth and contemporary communications style.
Stéphane Dujarric, spokesman of UN Secretary-General António Guterres, thanks for being with us tonight. My first question will be right now. Stéphane Dujarric, the world order issued from 1945 under US dominance is totally obsolete today. How do you view the new one shaping up with a strong Chinese and Russian move?
It is clear that the world from 1945, the date of the creation of the United Nations, has evolved quite a bit. To really boil it down to the essentials, we went from what was a bipolar world during the Cold War to what many called a unipolar world in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. And now we have a multipolar world where there are a number of nations that are centers of power that have a large impact on the world at large and on global affairs. The fact that the world changes should not be a surprise to anyone. What does remain a constant is the need for multilateral institutions, the need for a United Nations where everyone can come and sit down at the same table and try to solve the problems that we face today as a global community. We still need a table where we can come and discuss the issues of climate change, of global health, of terrorism, issues that really know no border and that span the world and can only be solved through global solutions. So the world changes, of course, but the need for multilateral institutions that are respected continues.
Stéphane Dujarric, when we watch closely the declarations made by Russian President Putin and his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, about the risks, quote, of a third world conflict, do the UN Secretary-General António Guterres and yourself take them seriously?
What we take seriously is that we have in Europe a war going on. We have Russia that invaded a sovereign state, that invaded Ukraine in violation of international law. And we have been very clear in what this situation is. And what this war is doing, and the reason we're taking this war seriously, it is having an impact not only, of course, on the country in question, on Ukraine, and the millions of Ukrainian men, women, and children, especially women and children, who were forced to flee their homes, who were forced to flee their countries, which has an impact on neighboring countries. But this conflict is also having a global impact. It is having an impact on energy prices throughout the world. It is having an impact on food prices throughout the world. It is having an impact on the availability of fertilizers globally, which means it will have an impact on hundreds of millions of people and their ability to be fed, on their ability to find energy sources at prices they can afford. So we are, of course, taking this conflict seriously. And that is why we have called for an end to this conflict as soon as possible.
But Stéphane, don't you think we are in the middle of a dangerous game between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who tries to have NATO directly involved in the conflict with Russia, and US President, on the other hand, Joe Biden, who wages war by proxy to weaken Vladimir Putin?
It is a conflict. It is a war, and it is, of course, very dangerous by any measure. And that's why the international community has a responsibility to try to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has a responsibility to try to end the conflict and to bring support to the millions of people in Ukraine and the hundreds of millions of people who are being impacted outside of Ukraine because of this conflict.
If the blockade of wheat delivery by Russia goes on, is there a risk of world food shortage, which would be a disaster for regions, I'm thinking of Africa and Middle East, with consequences on migration?
Well, it has, the fact that this war is continuing and the fact that Ukraine is not able to export its grain, its wheat, its sunflower. The fact that Russian grain and Russian fertilizer is not available on the open market is having a devastating impact on people, as you say, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in many other regions from Latin America to Asia. I'll give you an example. Somalia imports about 85% of its wheat product from either Ukraine, which is about 50%, and from Russia, which is about 35%. So a country that is already suffering from risks of famine and severe hunger due to climate change has an added shock to it. And Somalia is not the only one. It's just one example I've picked out. And that is why the Secretary General has been working very closely with the Russians, with the Ukrainians, with the Turks, who have been has a critical role in trying to get all these things out to market, also in consultations with authorities in Brussels and Washington to get this needed material out to market as soon as possible, because the longer the global food market does not have Ukrainian grain, or Russian fertilizer, the longer that goes on, the more the millions and millions of people are at even of greater risk than they already are.
According to the UN, can an agreement with Vladimir Putin still be possible, still be reached? If yes, under which acceptable conditions for both parties? If no, how do you see the issue of this war? I know you are not going to give me the solution, but what is your observation about that?
Well, I mean, listen, the fact is, as in any conflict, at some point, the parties, in this case Ukraine and Russia, will have to come to some agreement. We know the Turkish authorities had been hosting direct talks between the two on the political side. We hope that can continue. I think the Turkish mediation has been extremely important on that, as well as on the food issue. It's not for the Secretary General to impose a solution. What we want is to see a diplomatic and political solution to this conflict. What contours it will have, how this solution will, what it will look like, that will be up to the parties. But for that, they will need to sit down face to face and have a discussion.
According to you, it's a sensitive problem, sensitive question. Must Vladimir Putin be considered as a war criminal?
Look, the Secretary General of the United Nations is not in the business of branding people criminals. that is up to judicial authorities. What is clear is that we have from the beginning condemned all acts of all breaches of international law, and we have seen so many of them in this conflict. What is critical is that the International Criminal Court is investigating almost in real time. And that is a first, right? Because they have been invited by the Ukrainian authorities. The prosecutor, Mr. Khan of the International Criminal Court, has been to Ukraine. His teams are on the ground. Evidence is being gathered. And so they will need to be accountability. But that needs to go through a recognized criminal and judicial process. What is clear is that there have been what could very well tantamount to crimes, to war crimes in this conflict, but the confirmation of that will need to go through a international judicial process.
As a very keen observer of the world situation, Stéphane, according to you, is the new world shaping up, splitting into, on the one hand, a Chinese, Russian, Iranian axis, on the other hand, the free Western camp?
What we do not want to see is a decoupling. We do not want to see various blocs decouple from each other with separate trading agreements, separate internets, separate multilateral institutions. That would not benefit the people of the world. In a time where we face increasing problems and serious problems that really laugh in the face of borders, climate change and the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, to name just two, it is time not to decouple, but in a sense to recouple and to reaffirm the need for multilateral institutions that truly represent all member states, where all member states can sit at the table, where we don't have to waste time negotiating about who sits at the table, what the shape of the table is. But when you face problems like climate change, when you face problems like global health, when you face problems like what to do with artificial intelligence and the technology that we barely can control, let alone understand, we need institutions where everyone is represented.
Which is today the biggest concern or preoccupation for the UN?
Obviously, climate change is the highest and most existential problem that we are dealing with, that the Secretary General is focused on. He's extremely concerned about how whether it's the war in Ukraine or the pandemic has not only taken us back in or move towards renewable energy, taking us back in terms of people reinvesting in fossil fuels, which are a dead end, as opposed to reinvesting in clean, green energy. The fact that the clock is actually ticking on our ability to impact the climate in a positive way before it comes too late. That is a major preoccupation. The rise of hunger in the world linked to conflict is also extremely high on the Secretary General's agenda. And all of these issues are intertwined and interlinked, because the growth of hunger is linked to climate change. It is also linked to conflict, as we've explained, to conflict regionally, and conflict, of course, including Ukraine, given the fact that the conflict is taking place in what we call the breadbasket of the world.
As you know, Stéphane, Iran is on the verge of having the nuclear bomb. IAEA and the West obviously have been misled by what I call the Ayatollah since May 2019, when it started violating the 2015 agreement. Is, according to you, as an observer, I mentioned that as an observer, is Israel the only country being able to delay the Iranian nuclear deadline for want of preventing it?
We have been extremely clear in expressing our concern about Iran's lack of cooperation with the IAEA It's the fact that it hasn't fulfilled and is not fulfilling all of its obligations with the IAEA. I think the Director General, Mr. Grossi, has been very clear on that, expressing his very deep concern at the fact that the window of opportunity is closing for the international community. Mr. Grossi is the voice of the UN on nuclear, on these issues. The Secretary General fully backs him and his action and what he and his team have been doing. We also very much call on all the parties to the JCPOA to return to the table, to return to that agreement, which we feel is an important one. What we do not want to see are any unilateral actions by anyone which would make the situation worse. We believe, as a matter of principle within the United Nations, that these things need to be discussed through the multilateral system, but that in order for that to succeed, member states, including Iran, all member states need to live up to their commitments within that international system.
Is there, according to you, a risk of explosion, even upheaval, in the Middle East after the latest tensions between Israel, Iran, and its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad?
Look, you're describing a region that is extremely volatile, right? I mean, and it's been like that, sadly, and sadly for the people who live there, who are trying to survive there and live in peace, it has been very volatile for a long time. The best way to make it even more volatile is for people to engage in unilateral actions that will make matters worse. We believe that on the Israel-Palestine issue, that the two parties, the Israelis and the Palestinians, at the end will need to sit down and talk and find a way that will lead to that two-state solution that we continue to believe in, for the sake of Israelis who want to live in peace and for the sake of Palestinians who want to live in peace as well. But, you know, we're also seeing glimmers of hope in the region that you mentioned. I think it's important to note that we've now extended for a further 2 months the truce in Yemen. And we have not seen any major cross-border attacks by the Houthis into Saudi territory. We have not seen any major airstrikes that have been reported to us from the coalition into Yemen. This has been a kernel of hope, so to speak, that we are trying to build on. And it shows that even with parties that have very different views, that come at issues from different sides, their political differences can be put aside for the sake of civilians. I mean, if you look at Yemen, where this conflict has been going on, and you know, men, women, and children being bombed out of their homes, not having access to food, not having access to humanitarian aid. It is just what has been going on in Yemen for way too long is just heartbreaking. But we had an initial truce for 2 months. Our UN envoy, Mr. Grunberg, is trying to expand. It's been extended for a further 2 months. We're trying to build on that ray of hope. But it also shows that different parties can actually come to an agreement. But the interest of people need to be placed first and foremost.
Is Sahel, with the rise of Islamism through the Islamic State and AQMI all over this region, a source of serious concern for the Maghreb countries and consequently for Europe, and especially Southern Europe?
Well, first of all, it's a source of concerns for the millions of people who live in those countries, right? I mean, they are first and foremost the victims of insecurity, of, in too many places, the lack of strong state institutions. It is civilians in the Sahel who have been murdered and butchered and kidnapped and hurt by these Islamic fundamentalist groups who have been committing acts of terror and are terrorizing the population. We have been working very hard with what we call the G5 Sahel countries. As you may recall, they had put together a force, the G5 Sahel force, which sadly did not get and is not getting the predictable funding through Security Council resolution that that the Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, has been calling for now for more than 5 years. But the key to the solution to the problems in the Sahel is obviously goes through the finding a security solution, but also development, human rights, and the building of state institutions. On top of that, you are seeing the impact of climate change, which is pushing herders south into lands that people would, pastoralists have, and that is creating a dangerous clash. And of course, we're seeing the lack of the rise of food due partly also, not in small part, to the conflict in Ukraine.
I would like to finally get back to Afghanistan. After the Taliban's power takeover and the return to Middle Ages seems to have fallen into oblivion. Is there a chance, Stéphane, that the Taliban's put an end to their barbaric methods? Can they be eradicated, and how?
Well, I mean, I think that's also a question you need to ask. You need to ask the Taliban. For our part, I think it bears reminding that the UN never left the Afghan people. In September of last year, when the government fell, we saw a lot of departures, but the UN stayed, and we have stayed put. We have increased our programs. We are working with Afghan men, with Afghan women, to make sure that they have the help they need, and they need critical help. The fact that the Taliban have curtailed access to education to women and girls is outrageous, and frankly, sometimes the words don't truly portray what we think of these actions by the Taliban. You cannot hope to rebuild a country if you deny education to 50% of your population. If girls can't have an education, if women can't have an education, can't have access, free access to the workplace, your country will never be able to develop in a positive manner. Those are messages that we give to the Taliban leadership on a regular, if not daily basis, because we have to interact with them. They are the de facto authorities in Afghanistan, and we have no choice but to work with them. But I can tell you that our folks on the ground are very strong and strident in their defense of human rights, and especially of the rights of women and girls in their discussions with the Taliban.